The reason we chose to have this as a keynote during a food innovation conversation was really because electricity, power, costs, and competitiveness all come into play here for your companies and really the whole ag sector and quite frankly the whole world. So all the issues that surround all facets of agriculture involve power. This keynote's a chance to learn about what's going on in Ontario's electrical grid. Certainly there are grumblings, and whether those grumblings are well-founded or not, I think if you're thinking cheap power these days, you're thinking coal or an access to some kind of exceptional hydroelectric, which we're not all privileged to. But if you're thinking coal and you're doing all this kind of interesting stuff around the bioeconomy with agriculture, you're thinking in the wrong direction, in my opinion. I hope Bruce will support that opinion. The other thing, of course, too, is maintaining the grid, maintaining the infrastructure and updating the infrastructure so we're ready to compete for the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years.
I'm probably as close to what Keith Harris called a government technician as you can find in this room. I'm pretty impressed by all the entrepreneurship. It does remind me about why Deborah, who is on our board, why Deborah reminds me that it's a good idea to get out and talk to real people once in a while. And this afternoon has been a great example of that. Now, how many people had actually heard of the IESO before this got organized? That's not bad. Mostly, if you're having a drink with somebody and you're saying, who do you work for? And then you have to, first of all, if you apologize for, it's quite a long name, Independent Electricity System Operator, and then you have to apologize because you've made their eyes glaze over while you're explaining what that is. But I do want to start by talking a little bit about who we are and what we do. We like to describe ourselves as being at the heart of Ontario's power system. We don't actually own any of the assets in the system other than the control assets, so the generators are all owned either publicly or privately. Transmission system is primarily Hydro One, all the local distribution companies. We don't have any direct interest in any of that. What we do is basically make sure that all of that works together in the short and the long run in order to ensure a reliable supply of electricity now and in the future. So we've done a little list here of how do we do that? Well, we do planning, and we do planning over all time frames. When we talk about planning, that can be everything from planning what we have to have online for the afternoon, this afternoon, to keep the lights on, doing day ahead, looking at the weather, seeing what we can expect to get out of our new wind fleet in Ontario, what we can get out of our solar, where there are water problems, etc. So we plan in an operational sense. We also do the planning for the long term, and that culminates in things like the renewal of the Bruce Power contract recently. That's looking, instead of looking 5 minutes out, that's looking 50 years out. And we think about how to get through all of that time period right from the 5 minutes out to the 50 years. We enable conservation. That's, for us, is largely, with some exceptions, it's largely an administrative role. We partner with all of the local distribution companies across the province, about 70 plus local distribution companies. We have, when they're grouped together, we have about 40 contracts that for the delivery of conservation by the local distribution companies. And just to give you a sense of that program, the Conservation First program across the province, 6-year program, started in 2015, $2.2 billion. And on top of that, we administer about another further $500 million for all of the direct industrial conservation programs as well. So we help design those programs, administer them. Big lump of work there. We operate, as I say, we operate the power grid. So we direct, I think the technical term we use for it is we direct the operation because the assets aren't ours, but we tell generation across the province in light of what's happening on the power system. We tell generation across the province to ramp up or ramp down. We deal with all the loadings on the transmission system. The transmission system has limits on every part of it. You have to operate within carefully defined limits. If those power flows get beyond limits, that's when you get into trouble like we had in 2003 with the collapse of the power system in the Northeast, across the northeast of the continent. We ensure supply. So as I mentioned, things like the Bruce Power contract, we do procurements for supply. And of course, the world being what it is today, we don't just do that on the supply side. Through both our conservation programs, and I'll talk a little bit later about demand response, for us, we're looking at incremental power flows, incremental power requirements. And if we think there's got to be another 50 megawatts of power or demand on the system, the way we're trying to look at it these days is we try to be indifferent to whether we do that through supply or if somebody in their operations can reduce their load at a time of peak on the system, we'll pay them just the same way we would pay generators for producing. So what we're trying to do over time is get away from the world that we used to live in with coal plants and all central supply and big transmission, and take advantage of all of the new technologies that are out there. Of course, there's a big wind investment in Ontario, a big solar investment, new gas plants, coal shut down. So I'll come in a little bit and sort of kind of show you what that has made up, what's that meant for the makeup on the system. And the other thing we do is we have pretty strong engagement with stakeholders and communities. Stakeholders about maybe just our own particular programs, the market rules that they operate under, the market that I should have mentioned when I was talking about operating the grid in the wholesale market, I should have mentioned that market, which is kind of like the stock exchange for electricity, it really does run a market. We settle all of the transactions on the power system, so that's settling about $14 billion a year worth of transactions where we collect money from the LDCs and we pay the generators and the transmitters, and the cash flows that are there, as I say, amount to about $14 billion a year. On the stakeholder and community side, and I'll come back to this maybe a little bit later, we take a good deal of pride in maintaining really strong conversations with all of the stakeholders in our industry. We have what we call a stakeholder advisory committee that has representation from across the province. And we also, more and more, are putting focus on regional planning. Instead of just looking at the province as one sort of at a high level and planning in effect down, we're doing a lot more of forming regional advisory groups to plan electricity infrastructure regionally in the same way that municipal land use planners plan locally as well. It is amazing to me how many places we go where if you talk to the land use planners, they've got, they'll have land uses mapped out for all kinds of different areas of their jurisdictions. That's okay. All kinds of land use plans, but there isn't an electrical line shown anywhere on it. A lot of, the roads are there. Sometimes the gas is there. The schools, the parks, the playgrounds, but people just expect that the electricity will just show up. And we're trying very hard to kind of ensure that in local planning, there's a lot more attention paid to electricity as it goes in, as those plans are being made, and that people understand the choices today, because the choices today are quite different. Microgrids, technologies, building to higher standards, offering services back into the electricity system instead of just withdrawing power from the electricity system. And we're trying to encourage communities to take a look at the resources that they have in the communities and they may want to make different choices in this part of the province as opposed to that part of the province. And what we're trying to do is facilitate very much that kind of local planning. Wrong way. Let me talk a little bit about the change that we're dealing with. I mean, I see tremendous change in your business. This has been a real education for me. The kind of things that are going on are amazing. But we've gone through and are continuing to go through the same kind of change as well. If you look on at the circle on the left, you'll see the top gray area, coal, and you'll see next to it to the left, solar, wind, and bioenergy at less than 1% in 2005. This is a capacity picture. That is the sort of nameplate rating of all of the generation equipment that's out there. If you look at 2015, you'll see that the coal has disappeared and that the solar, wind, bioenergy has grown to about 20% if you put that all together. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our world as system operators. If you have a coal plant, you got a big pile of coal out there. The afternoon comes along and people start coming home and turning on their stoves. Power use goes up. You just put that coal on a conveyor belt, put it into the generating station, and you get power coming out the other side. It's a whole different world than that 20% of solar, wind, bioenergy demand response, where you're interacting much more directly with your customers on the demand response side to say, look, instead of having the ramp take us up 1,000 megawatts, if you can reduce your requirement by 50 megawatts, that's 50 megawatts we don't need to produce. It's also the case, of course, though, that we may have predicted, as we try to do every day, predict what wind farms are going to produce, what the various wind farms are going to produce. And we're not as good at forecasting the weather as we were in how much coal there was in the coal pile. These are two entirely different exercises. So our life has become much more uncertain on a whole lot of levels. We're dealing with a whole lot more people. We're dealing with a whole lot more market participants, and the variability of what we see on the system is increasing dramatically. So the way we run our business and the way we operate the system has changed quite a bit. That's not going away. We've adapted pretty well to what we've got so far, but you'll see in the 225 circle on the right, you'll see that we expect demand response to increase dramatically, people kind of taking charge of their own consumption. We see more solar, wind, et cetera, coming along. And so our world continues to change as we deal with the uncertainty and variability on the system. Now, I haven't seen a hand go up yet. I must be real. There we go, right there.
Do you guys track your carbon footprint or our carbon footprint through time?
We are starting to do so. Obviously, we're actually right now, we're a very low carbon system. So we can, I don't have it here, but we can, for the province, can show in the electricity sector, the decline in carbon has been dramatic. And certainly by North American standards, in fact by world standards, we are now a very low carbon system. So I think the simple answer is yes. And under the cap and trade scheme, we'll be also accounting as power comes into the province from over our interconnections, we'll also be tracking the carbon content of that so that it can be priced in the same way that electricity is going to be priced in Ontario. Yeah?
where do you take into account storage? I just read the latest book about Tesla, and I have to ask, I don't see any storage on there.
So, no, I haven't got storage up here, but we are exploring that. We've got about, I think now, 50 megawatts coming onto the system. We started a couple of years ago and did a procurement for storage, which we now have on the system, but it's relatively short term, the first tranche that we did. So what it's doing for us is it's doing the little split second adjustments. So electricity is a really interesting product, and I'll try not to be the technician that I love to be. But it's a really interesting product because if you think about it, it's a manufactured product, number one, but it's a manufactured product that apart from storage has to be consumed the very instant it's produced. You've got to keep those two things in balance all at once. I used to say about electricity, there's no such thing as inventory. And think of you running your businesses. What role inventory management can be a critical part of having a successful supply chain. What storage can give us is the equivalent of inventory. We use it for very short-term stuff now. We've just signed a bunch of contracts, I think about 15 megawatts worth, to try and stretch that time frame and see what we can do with that. But I think the place storage is really going to make a difference if it becomes economic is the kind of Tesla battery wall or power wall that they talk about. That sort of thing, if it becomes economic and can be integrated into households with some solar, some economic battery technology, then think about your electric cars, and then think about all of those working together so that you become, in effect, a little power producer all on your own. There'll be times when you can put power back into the system as well as times where you'll want to take it out. I firmly believe that's coming, but the issue, the concern I have is when do you actually know that it's coming fast enough and quick enough that you really have to change your business to adapt to it? And so when's that real inflection point? And I don't have an answer to that question, but I do think it's a matter of when, not if, that those technologies will change. I think people forget sometimes, though, you think of a technology coming into the power sector. So let's just use an example like a new, more efficient way to control or put in switches. The switches across the system that switch power here and there. Somebody comes along with a new technology and they say, well, it's all tested out, it's great, it's utility grade, let's start using it. Well, you've got a whole bunch of that, you got like 15,000 of those kinds of switches out there on the system, none of which are depreciated. They're still all on the books or partway through their asset life. So the turnover time sometimes for these technologies, even though the industry in its stodgy old way actually does adopt the technology, to work it through the system takes time as well. So there's kind of two time constants that we worry about. One is what does it take to work that technology through the industry, and what's the time at which it actually becomes useful. Yeah.
Have you actually done a calculation of when that tipping point will come? I mean, you know that the cost for buying power continues to rise, and it will get that point where I can buy a solar panel for my roof and buy some batteries and use most of it to power my house. There's got to be a calculation for that from your perspective that would change all those graphs.
Yeah, we see, solar's coming down every couple of years. You can argue about whether it's lop off 50% or 25%. Doesn't matter. Is it coming down? Yes. I think the critical thing, though, for that, take your household example, is are you prepared to cut your wire to the grid?
Well, you don't need to cut it, you just have to adapt to it.
But this really affects the economics. Because if you keep your wire connected to your house, then the power system has to be ready to supply over that when you call on it. In effect, you are using the power system as the backup to everything that you do, and that's not a free good. And in fact, the Ontario Energy Board is starting to look at this issue, this very issue, and say we should move distribution system charges away from being based on kilowatt hours through the wire and just have a charge for that connection and the ability to draw on the grid when you need it. But if you so be careful doing the economics, because you've got to figure in, am I doing this cutting the wire, or am I still going to want the reliability that being connected to the system provides? And there's lots of argument about this. I mean, depending on the system, how many motors, for instance, are you starting off the system? When you start a motor on a power system, it has an immediate hard draw. Is your solar and battery system, what size does it have to be? What technical characteristics does it need to have in order to do that? So, again, I think these things will happen, but I haven't figured out any algorithm that'll tell me the speed for which it'll happen or exactly when it gets to that price point. But yes, we're keeping an eye on it. There's lots of great work done around North America that tries to forecast what's happening with all of these prices. The feeling seems to be at the moment that the thing that they're going to have trouble reducing is you can reduce the cost of the panels, but the cost of contracting, installation, etc., is much less resistant to, or is much more resistant to reduction than the hardware costs. Seems to be where the debate is happening right now. Yeah.
I'm not sure what the difference between natural gas and demand response is in terms of your supply.
So this is, the natural gas here is just it's essentially the new natural gas generating stations that we have put onto the system.
And run all the time?
They do not run. They have a very low capacity factor. So they were brought in to provide reliability as the coal retired, and they do provide quick response.
Well, I thought that was demand response, so what is demand response?
Well, demand response is anyone who can, on a predictable or on a contracted basis, reduce their load when we call on them, the same way we would call on a generator. So
Reduce load.
it's reducing load. So if I'm seeing load go up, and I expect it might go up another 25 megawatts, the control room may call on a demand response, say, you get off the system to accommodate this load that's coming up, or if no one's available, they have to run generation up. So that's really, demand response is pushing down, particularly at peak times. Yes?
There's technology out there right now that is taking wastes or diverting waste from landfills and creating electricity. How is that factored at all into your equation here that's presented? And how close are we to adopting that?
Well, there are facilities like that in Ontario right now. It's not big enough here, I think, to break out. But for instance, if when I drive east from Toronto, out by the Darlington station, there's a big, if you drive by, there's a big new plant just before you get to the Darlington station that is, I think it's Durham region, and it's taking household waste essentially and producing both. Essentially, all they're producing there is electricity. Now, some of those kinds of technologies, if you look in some of the European countries, they're right in the middle of the city where they're producing heat and electricity locally, which is, these are always citing issues are always an issue around this, though. Yes?
I noticed that nuclear's really dropped off by 2025. Is that something that you expect to see further drop off?
I'm still on the capacity. So, no, that nuclear this is a capacity graph, so that nuclear in 2025 reflects the fact that that's the very middle of the refurbishment period for both the Darlington plant and the Bruce Power plant. So by 2025, it's expected that the Pickering units, there are 6 units still operating at Pickering, that they will shut down by about that time. At the same time, Bruce Power will be in the middle of its big refurbishment program, so there'll be units that are out of service at Bruce Power, and the same thing at Darlington. The Darlington announcement got made in January, and we signed the contract with Bruce Power back in December. Yes?
2 questions. Do you anticipate a decrease in demand over the next decade?
Probably
of electricity. And then the second question is, do you currently or anticipate charging different rates depending on the source of the electricity?
So remind me of the second one. I'll deal with the first one, which was demand. Right now we're seeing the demand at pretty much going to be flat, probably over much of the 20s is the best forecast at the moment that we have. That allows for a lot of conservation. I talked to the investment that we're making in conservation, and that pulls down the demand. We're looking at sort of 7 terawatt hours, 8 terawatt hours out of a total system demand that otherwise would be about 145 to 150 terawatt hours. Conservation will pull that down. We're netting out around round numbers, I'll just use round numbers, about 140 terawatt hours of energy over that time period. So pretty flat. I think, again, there's some uncertainties around all of this that we have to think about in our planning, and one of them is whether there will be increased electrification of the economy generally. And this, of course, is part of the carbon argument, part of the carbon debate that's going on. And, I think what we see is people talk about, well, let's switch on to renewables, but you don't actually switch on to, it isn't wind that you're using, it's the electricity wind produces. It isn't the sunlight that you're using, it's the electricity that the sunlight produces on a solar farm. So a lot of what people talk about in terms of renewables ends up being electricity production. And in order to avoid carbon, the debate is to do transportation, much more electrification in transportation. And even, it's the first time in a long time that I've heard a lot of debate starting up about electrification of very high efficiency buildings, so heating in particular. Cooling it's a lot of electricity involved there in any event, but the expanding use of electricity clearly is something that, again, has the potential, I think, to move those forecasts around quite a bit, something that we try to track pretty closely. Yes?
Do you have a priority of which source of power you buy from first, second, third?
Yes, our priority is price. So we take all of those different types of generation have produced at different price levels. And what we do is every 5 minutes, we accept offers from all across the province, from all the generation. We stack those up in order of price. And wherever the line is as to what the demand requires, that's the price for the market. And the market clears at that price. Now, I've kind of oversimplified that a little bit because we also have to worry about things like reliability. The cheapest power may be from a an older hydraulic plant up in the Northeast, but if the transmission lines coming down from the Northeast are already full, we can't take that power. So we juggle all of this all across the province and do it every 5 minutes. There's a lot of IT on this. I sometimes describe the company as being an IT company that happens to be in electricity. But there's a number of criteria that have to be used, but essentially we run the market to make sure that you're getting your electricity at the lowest production cost that we can possibly give you. Yeah.
So then where did the original contracts for wind and solar fit into that? Do you not have an obligation to buy that first?
No. And there are times when where we have to back down both, well, really all of the different sources. There are times in the province when our online nuclear and baseload hydraulic, the kind of run-of-river hydraulic, exceeds the amount of power that is being used in the province. So surplus baseload generation is the phrase we use, and it's something that, as the load profiles have changed, we are seeing quite a bit of.
And what do you do with that?
We do all kinds of things with it. We turn down plants, some of whom get paid for being turned down. We export. With surplus generation, we export a lot. And I can talk about that for a little bit if you want, because people always say, well, how come you're exporting at this low price? And which is what happens. People are buying power out of the province. When you're in surplus, of course, that's the time when the price is low. And I certainly watch all the coverage around all of that as people complain about that. But the fact is, the way I look at it is, we have these assets in the province. We do, by making those sales, collect money that offsets part of the cost of all of the equipment, and we would not collect that money if we didn't make the sales. So to some extent, it's like every other business. If you have a surplus in your product that you need, that is perishable, then you need to get whatever price you can for it, and that's basically, the export market is a trader's market.
Do you ever pay people to take your power?
We pay generators to turn down. We occasionally get, all electricity markets occasionally get negative pricing. And let me tell you, I'll give you an example there. If I'm a nuclear plant and I see a period of time when the demand in the province is not sufficient to keep me online, I'm going to get turned off. Then what happens with the nuclear plant, for instance, once it goes down a certain amount, it takes a couple of days before the reactor can stabilize. This is reactor chemistry. Before the reactor can stabilize and then come back up to full power. So it may actually be quite worthwhile, if it's a Sunday afternoon, for a nuclear plant to bid a negative price so that its power then gets taken at a negative price, paying somebody to take the power from that plant. We share all of this across the system, but I'll just treat it as if it was a single transaction. So they would rather pay to have somebody take the power from their plant than go down on a Sunday afternoon and then not be able to produce on a Monday or Tuesday. So these are, it always seems odd to talk about negative prices, although I do see musings these days about negative interest rates, which really, even I have a little trouble with that one. But this is basically just the way markets work, and our market is not alone in having that kind of situation from time to time. Yes, I'll come back to you. just so you've got me here.
Actually, my question is actually a little odd. It's a diversion. As value added as all these questions are, I'm actually genuinely interested to see the rest of your presentation too. I just want to make sure you
Okay.
Just curious, 2015, 2016, let's say solar, wind, bio is what, 20% of the capacity?
Yeah.
What percentage of the total cost?
I don't.
I mean, how much more is solar, wind, and bio energy cost in current, you said, based on price?
It depends on whether you're talking about it kind of an all-in price or the cost of production. It's a very low cost of production, obviously, but there is a cost that we pay through the global adjustment charge that is, in effect, the capital cost of that. Right. And I think the original FIT contracts were started out at about, I think it's around 14 cents kilowatt hour. That is all ratcheted down, and we're in fact now we're, instead of a FIT program, when we're completing the procurements now are based on competitive bidding. So we expect to see quite a bit lower prices, both for reasons of technology advancement and because we're now doing it on a fully competitive basis. Yeah.
I don't know why, but just a couple of days ago, I decided to kind of figure out what our electricity was costing us from about 9 months ago, and it's went up about 24% in the last 9 months. When I see what solar and wind's going to do over the next 10 years, is that going to tell me what our electricity bill is going to look like in the years to come?
It will add to the global adjustment payments. So I don't think I can promise you lower rates. What I can say is that we work hard to keep the costs as low as we reasonably can. There isn't a meeting I go to where somebody doesn't raise the question of what are we doing to bend the cost curve. But putting this investment into wind, solar, putting the investment into the plants that we have has cost and continues to cost money. I haven't forgotten. Yes.
I just got a quick question on this. Do we, let's say, the business of power management here, they look at economic development as a way of marketing and managing the power use from the province? I really see that as attracting new businesses here that are going to utilize power and create jobs is important. But I don't really feel that the power companies are going out there trying to actively find new companies that could be building in the province. And create jobs.
I think some of the pricing mechanisms that have been put in place, and I can touch on this a little bit, show you a picture of this a little bit later on. But for instance, for the industrial users, and now anyone over 3 megawatts average load, there are, by controlling their load at peak times, they can significantly reduce their costs. I'll just, let me flash ahead here now. Okay, so the blue bars at the bottom are, for each year, the production costs of electricity, given the suite of plants that we have. The yellow bars are what's paying for all of that investment, what's paying for conservation, et cetera. So anyone with an average load over 3 megawatts has the opportunity to operate their plant so that on the 5 highest peak days of the year, they try to guess when they are, and they try and reduce their output. And if to the extent that they're successful in reducing their output, they can avoid some of that global adjustment charge. So I think the long answer to your question is that, yes. And there are programs in the province that do reduce costs for larger users, larger industries in particular. And the other thing I have to say is we also, we have this whole suite of conservation programs. And of course, one of the big objectives for all of these programs is to reduce cost. So while the price of the commodity, including global adjustment, is rising, we work hard in our conservation programs to try and provide people with tools to kind of, and incentives to reduce their use, conserve, use more wisely. So I think the answer to your question is yes, there's a lot going on to try and reduce costs, but the fundamentals, but I don't want to glaze over the kind of fundamentals of the additions that we're making to the system as well.
I understand reducing costs, that's obviously important, but attracting a new business to the province. A company that's not here today that's going to come in and build a brand new plant, utilize their electricity, create jobs in our province. And I know more companies that make a decision not to come here because the electricity price is too high.
But I think, as I say, there are programs that can offset an awful lot of those costs and can make operations in Ontario quite competitive.
So we need a marketing person within your business to go to market that for the company.
And that's the folks who run the conservation programs, and that's exactly what they do. Exactly what they do. We have a Save on Energy brand that drives a lot of this, and you'll be seeing a lot more of that as well. Okay?
I just have a really quick question. I know the Save on Energy, and I've gone to your site, and it's an interesting site where we have one called Click Here about getting an energy manager for your company.
Yeah.
And you click there, it says click to your local energy provider. You click to the local energy provider. For their end, it says click here to look about an energy manager, and it takes it back to your site. And I've been doing this.
You're kidding me. You're not kidding me, are you?
No, it's off. I just did it now to prove it. The interesting thing is and it's interesting because I actually called the local people and said, what's going on here? And I've done it for Guelph, I've done it for, we just did it for Waterloo, Wellington. So some of these programs, I mean, I tried to tell people about them, and it's like, well, there's nothing there. And like you were just talking about we promoted to one dairy up in Eastern Ontario to go with the idea of just a response. And suddenly now it's in process of being reevaluated because the idea if you have a dairy, you usually have a backup generating system. So when there's a peak demand, at one time you could negotiate with, say, with the power group to go and say, okay, when we need that energy, you flip over to your generating system, and we'll give you a cut in your rate because when we don't need it, you go back. So that was gone. But now it's always, these things are always in process of being redeveloped. Or click here and you get back to it. And it's, I spent like 5 hours going back and forth. So I just wanted to tell you, I was looking at this and thinking, oh my God, I have some reasons. Not very simple.
I will not try and defend a circular thing. It takes you just right back to where you started. I won't pretend about that. And thank you. I will be calling back to the office. But that said, the conservation and the conservation demand management, demand response programs that we run are, frankly, primarily managed through the local distribution companies. And the view is that the local distribution companies are closer to their customers, know them better, should know what they need better. But we're pretty dedicated to the success of these programs. And so, as I say, we'll call back to the office this afternoon.
Trying to run these programs for about 20 years. We have a person that goes around as energy audits for food processing, and it's just when you're getting down to the local level, a lot of times they don't have anybody there to actually administer the program. So, if you're just Wellington County, they may not know what you do with the application.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave you with my card and send me, I'm serious, we want feedback on these, on how stuff's working. You know, there's no point in doing this if it isn't working. So, what would...
have done it quietly.
Yes.
Just a quick question, echo the gentleman's comment at the table over there. I come from the commercial real estate business, and we look at multiple global companies looking at Ontario. And I can tell you, once they get past the cost of square foot and the lease, they zero in on utilities. And that is a big decision whether they come. Because these are smart people, and they say, what are we paying in Michigan, what are we paying where? And I can tell you that Ontario is not falling in favor of there, for sure. And those aren't one-off deals, these are multiple deals happening on a daily basis.
Yeah, you know, I follow those kinds of comparisons, and all I can say to you is take a look at those prices with the incentives that those kinds of projects can earn, and it changes the picture dramatically.
So my comment would be, you need to educate every landlord and developer in Ontario, because they're not getting that message. And you're losing out on jobs to people that want to move to Ontario to come and build a factory, a commercial entity, whatever. And I'm telling you, utilities is a huge, huge job.
Okay, well, I'll you know, I note that well. What I can tell you is we're working hard to get that education out there. We really are. Yeah.
I'm coming at it from the other end. I see major companies, and I agree with you, you don't pay for the electricity, you pay for the infrastructure. And they are going off grid. Natural gas is so cheap, you can put in gas generators, go off grid. A lot of them are looking at it, some are starting to institute it now. But what happens then is everybody else has to pay for that infrastructure when they become, and they're usually big users that can pay for it. We all then have to pick up that cost. How are we going to address that kind of thing? It's starting to happen because of competitive technologies where you're self-sufficient in electricity off of the natural.
Yeah, I mean, that's why, as we look forward, the planning is becoming more complicated, not less complicated. All of those things get looked at. We're starting into a process this year of a new long-term energy plan for the province. This, of course, is led by the government, not so much by us, but we provide a lot of the analysis and information that goes into that process, and that's just the kind of problem we worry about. You know, it goes back to the question about solar and battery. There's an infrastructure that gets that wire to your house. If you cut that wire, how much of that is stranded? And these are serious issues. Yes?
It's really great. We're in the farming business. Things are great. The hydro supply at our farms just lately, since when I grew up as a child, is much more consistent than it used to be. Like the hydro's hardly ever out now. It costs a bit more. Things are good. I see throughout the province, you guys are putting in like strategically located power with all the variety sources of solar, wind, and biogas, and all this stuff. You do a pretty good job. Like hydro's already out. They said it's bad. The tickets are there. Don't work. The toilet's full. The wife's mad. And it's not good. But one of the things that nobody's mentioned here today is strategically located power. I believe is very important because it takes power to move power. We look in today's world of terrorism, bad things, all this sort of stuff. Like we're pretty vulnerable with just 3 or 4 sources, towers all side by side, and things like that. And you know, when you diversify, like you have done with these other sources of power, and today's switching is a pretty good way being able to protect against things like rolling blackouts, you know, multiple source streams of power coming in. And the way you've done it is you have the industry building the things. We don't afford companies building big nukes and stuff like that. I think it's great. And I guess what I'm trying to ask in a roundabout way is how worried should
hydro and possibly disruptions and terrorism and stuff. I know, where I live, my son-in-law works at one of the major hydro companies, and they switch whenever things kind of go bad to keep the essential things powered and stuff. So the technology, in a lot of cases, is there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a very resilient power system in the province. Over time, as we do more and more regional planning, in an era of relatively flat load growth, we address things on a more regional basis, which just adds to that diversity and adds to that resilience. So, the folks in my control room, what are they about? They're about totally dedication to keeping the power flowing to people across the province. And I think we've got a resilient system and a reliable system for doing that. We have parts of it that are aging that'll have to be upgraded, but that's part of the natural running of the business. The fact of the matter is that, as I started out saying, I want to thank Tyler for the opportunity to come out. I love the questions. It's way more fun than running to the slides. I'll leave my copy of the slides with the gentleman here who was interested in them, and I think you can post them. I think you've got them to be posted, so that's fine too. But it's a great thing to get out and not be the, what was the phrase that was used, being the government technician. So answering questions in this crowd has been anything but being a government technician. So thank you very much.